Okay, I hope the sound's okay. Okay, this is called Gentle Winds. If it be thy pleasure, if it be thy pleasure, make me to grow as a tender herb. If it be thy pleasure, if it be thy pleasure, make me to grow as a tender herb in the meadows of thy grace. Ooh, ooh, of thy grace. Ooh, that the gentle winds of thy will, the gentle winds of thy will, that the gentle winds of thy will may stir me up. Oh, the gentle winds of thy will, the gentle winds of thy will, that the gentle winds of thy will may stir me up, may stir me up. Ooh, may stir me up. Ooh, and bend me into conformity with thy pleasure. Oh, and bend me into conformity with thy pleasure. In such wise that my movement and stillness, in such wise that my movement and stillness, in such wise that my movement and stillness may be
Are things okay with you?
wholly lifted by thee.
Okay. Good plan. No, I noticed.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks for those who've joined. And very, very excited to be here. Very excited for this topic. You are here because we're going to listen to Dr. Phelps address this topic of what is truth. And I'll just read the brief description here. So, what is truth? Offering some context to this question from the perspective of philosophy, science, and religion. And he will touch on the problem of truth in the age of social media before moving to the heart of the presentation, which is a discussion of the concept of truth found in the Baha'i writings. Dr. Stephen Phelps received dual bachelor's degrees in physics and philosophy from Stanford University and a Ph.D. in physics from Princeton University, specializing in cosmology. He worked for 13 years at the Bahá'í World Center in Haifa in its research department, where he coordinated the indexing and collation of the Bahá'í Sacred Writings and their translation from Persian and Arabic into English. And I just want to personally say I've had an opportunity recently actually to be listening to some of his talks on YouTube. And if you're inspired by what you hear tonight, I highly recommend you just Google Stephen Phelps on YouTube, and there's an amazing cadre of talks and videos of presentations he done in this theme, in this area, and going beyond this, and just phenomenal to listen to. I'm so happy that we have people like this in the Baha'i world that have gone to such depths in thinking about these concepts that are so important to us, especially today when we're talking about truth and where there's really no basis, or people feel completely lost and mistrusting of anything they hear now. So very, very happy to be here. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Brett, for those very kind words. I am, as the day for this talk approached, I became more and more terrified at what I had done, because this is the kind of a topic that cannot be done any justice to in this kind of a format. What I do have, however, some slides that I'd like to share, and maybe I could do that if I can share my screen. All right, thumbs up if you can see this. Everything looks good. So I have to start with a bunch of caveats, apart from what human being is qualified to talk about such a vast and ancient topic. Of course, this is a question that's been asked by everyone at some point. It's been asked by humans throughout history. It's everyone's question. It's not the province of an expert to think about or talk about. We're all on individually and collectively on a process of attempting to get at the truth. It's somehow programmed into us, you could say, to strive to reach the truth. So how would you introduce a topic like this in a way all of human thought touches upon it? So you need to just summarize human history. Not going to happen. So instead, I'll pick an arbitrary starting point, which will, I suppose, do for the purpose of getting us to an equally, perhaps, arbitrary ending point. Hopefully not too arbitrary. My starting point will be the question of what is truth from a very particular cultural perspective, which is that of Western philosophy. This is an interesting perspective to us, partly because it represents an extended conversation that we have detailed record of that's taken place over around 2,500 years. That in itself makes it interesting. It's also very interesting to us in the West because it forms so much of the cultural foundations of our thinking. So as a starting point, I suppose we could do worse. Many people have attempted to define philosophy in relationship to truth, and my attempt at doing this would be the following: that philosophy can be defined as thinking in a reasoned way about what is true and what we ought to do as a consequence.
Stephen?
And yes.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. We're having in the chat, some people are saying they can't hear very well. So I just want to validate some things first. I hear you very perfectly, but I'm wondering, do you have an input volume that you can turn up just to be safe?
Not that I know of.
I hear very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do too.
Maybe on an individual participant's screen with the.
I hear well.
Yeah, Louise and I hear well.
Yeah, I hear well too.
I hear well.
Okay.
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 Well, I'll proceed on that assumption, although our truths may differ on that point. So,
Sorry, everybody else is loud, but you, Stephen, you sound like you're whispering. So I think you're just not reaching the threshold for some devices. If you could just bring it up one notch.
Okay. I actually do not know of.
If you, Stephen, you see the microphone, like the audio microphone
It's
on the.
completely at the max. If his voice is just low enough, then it's just not getting through. So maybe get closer to the microphone. I'm not the,
All
I know
right.
I'm not the only one that's experiencing this.
Testing. Is that a little bit better? I just turned up my input level.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Help. Okay. All right. Okay. So my starting point will be an attempted definition of philosophy really through the lens of Western philosophy, that it has something to do with thinking in a reasoned way about what is true and what we ought to do as a consequence. So I've color coded this, and you'll see this color coding pulled throughout the presentation. And I won't refer to it much beyond this, but you'll hopefully see the pattern behind the thinking which is established in the next couple of slides. So by thinking in a reasoned way, we're talking about a branch of philosophy known as epistemology, which can be summarized as the study of how we come to know what we know, what the limits of human reason are, what the modes are for how we explore the world, and how we gain justified true belief about the world. In green is metaphysics. What is it that's true? What is out there that we are talking about when we talk about truth? And in yellow, I have ethics, another great branch of philosophy, which is concerned with human behavior, particularly human behavior as a consequence of what we have established is true. So this is an attempt to pull together in one place a number of distinct but related ideas. And the Western tradition of philosophy, as I mentioned, is interesting to us because we have such a detailed record over such a long period of time. Through this tradition, the question has been asked, particularly using the faculty of reason, how do we arrive at the truth? And I specify using the faculty of reason because the Western tradition of philosophy is really centered on using reason to get at the truth, as distinct from from using the senses observation of the world. That's more the province of science, or tradition or divine inspiration, which would more be the province of culture and religion. So not only can we divide philosophy into these three main areas and crunch them into one sentence, but we can also, on like a postage stamp or a t-shirt, talk about the history of Western philosophy throughout these 2,500 years as, of course, in an oversimplified way, but maybe not too oversimplified, as progressing through three major phases. What we would call the pre-modern phase, in which the main question was, what is the world made of? We refer particularly to those philosophers who came before Socrates and Plato in ancient Greece in 600, 500 BC, who were the first to try to systematically ask the question, what is the world made of? Is it all water in the end? Is it all fire? Is it something else? Is it four elements? Is it atoms? Is it something nameless? A lot of philosophizing was done around this question of what constitutes the world at the foundational level, what we would call the study of metaphysics. In the modern period, and particularly beginning with the French philosopher Descartes in the 1600s, the main thrust of philosophy turns from metaphysics, trying to describe what is there, to epistemology, asking, well, how do we know what is there? How do we know what we know? Descartes famously began by adopting a very skeptical hypothesis of trying to clear the ground of everything he thought he knew, and to start from zero, and to try to rebuild a system of knowledge, having cleared away as an attempt to rid himself of any sort of preconceived biases, to try to start from that fact of which he could possibly have no doubt, which is, I think, therefore I am, and to build everything from that point. In the modern period, and I'm talking about really the 20th century forward, or let's say the late 19th century forward, the project of philosophy, having largely abandoned metaphysics, this quest for the ultimate substances of things, turns more to ethics. It turns more to, well, what should we do in the world? How should we act in the world? How should we act in relation to others? How do we apply philosophical thinking to economics and politics and other sorts of human concerns that are relative to our being in the world? So, too short, but that's my attempt. And as you'll see, it's color coded against these three major areas in philosophy. So to take the first of these, the philosophy as metaphysics, and to look at the question of truth from that perspective, I think that for most of us, our most immediate intuition of what truth is, how we define truth, probably comes more from the ancient sources than from the modern sources. In particular, it would come from something like the famous allegory of Plato's cave, which probably most of us have heard of. The idea that we're like prisoners chained to the floor of a cave, constrained only to see one wall of that cave on which are projected the shadows of the real objects that are behind us, forever out of our vision, but projected in shadowy form on the walls of that cave. And we go through our whole lives looking at the shadows on the wall and taking them to be reality, when as in reality, it's the objects behind us that are more real. And then to extend that cave metaphor, those who are able to break free of their chains can turn around and see the source of those shadowy figures and realize, oh, there's something more real. And then furthermore, they can exit the cave and emerge into the sunlight and realize that reality has levels, has stages, and that there are higher realities which become more and more abstract. Plato's dialogues talk about the perception of reality, which is gained through the reasoned contemplation of what he calls the forms, which are taken to be those elements of ultimate reality, of which everything that we perceive is a imperfect copy. So this idea of the correspondence theory of truth is very compelling. It has been foundational to both science and religion throughout the centuries. The idea is very congenial, of course, to the scientific project, which sees itself as uncovering or discovering the laws of physics through research and observation of the physical world. These laws of physics being seen almost as Platonic entities existing in some non-physical realm, that through the operations of our reason combined with observation we can penetrate to. That's a very kind of Platonic way of thinking about science, and I think many scientists think about it that way. But this idea of truth by correspondence is also very congenial to Western religions. The idea that there's a spiritual world behind the physical world, of which physical things are maybe imperfect, shadowy copies or representations. So in a way, the two share at heart something very fundamental: the scientific project and the project of theology expressed through a Judeo-Christian Islamic lens, through, for example, Christian scholasticism and the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and so forth. These individuals see spiritual truth as a system of knowledge, maybe complementary to the system of knowledge that science brings into being, that obeys logical rules that are exposed through reason. But there are problems with the correspondence theory of truth. First of all, if you define truth as that which corresponds to reality, in a way, you're just pushing the question back one level. It becomes a kind of a language game. Okay, we've explained this word in relationship to this other word, but now what do we mean by this other word? What do we mean when we talk about reality? In a way, we haven't explained anything. We've just sort of performed a little bit of linguistic sleight of hand. And if we ask, well, the question, well, what is reality? And we get an answer in terms of words, well, that's just more words that we're going to have to unpack. So is it turtles all the way down? Is it just language all the way down chasing its own tail? That's a question that emerges when we ask, when we try to define truth according to this correspondence principle. But perhaps even more importantly, which reality are we talking about? If we say truth is that which corresponds to reality, which reality, and especially whose reality? We look historically at different groups, especially religion, which has abused its position, its privileged position in regard to what people consider as truth, especially capital T truth. It's abused its position in the name of that truth, and that abuse is difficult for us to forget. It gives us perhaps a kind of innate suspicion about anyone who comes forward to speak in the name of truth, because we see what has been done with that in the past. Another example, not just religion, that religion has abused the notion of truth purposes of power. But also, if we look at the scientific project as another example, applying this correspondence theory of truth, our best model of reality, according to physics, is that the ultimate ground of being is physics, which is matter, stuff, but also fixed patterns and symmetries, which are all described mathematically and quantitatively. Matter ultimately resolves down to quantum numbers. There's no volume, there's no actual stuff filling space, but everything ends up becoming points, geometric points, and vanishes into a kind of something very precise and mathematical, but it ultimately vanishes into number. I think Pythagoras would love to see what modern physics has done, because Pythagoras was one of the ancient Greek philosophers who also believed that in the end everything is number. This way of looking at the world, this way of grounding being, this way of talking about what is ultimately true, has been phenomenally successful. Here we are in a Zoom call, which in every aspect is made possible by incredible advances in technology resulting from this exploration of the world as physical, but it doesn't describe the world we actually inhabit. We inhabit a world full of minds, of purposes. We have inner lives and consciousnesses, which are not described by number. It's hard to see how we can get from a description of ultimate truth as number and quantity, and these mathematical relationships, to the qualitative nature of reality that we actually experience. And that's why I think neither the scientific project nor I think this idea of the correspondence theory of truth has attained universal assent up until this day. There are other options. So a second great contender for truth, apart from the correspondence theory of truth, would be something we might call revealed truth. That is, truth is something which is given to us. It is revealed from that other realm. If you're a Platonist, from the Platonic realm, revealed to us. If you are a Christian theologian, you'd say it's revealed by God through Jesus Christ. This way of looking at truth ultimately as being revealed by an other begs the question that was posed first in I think Plato's Euthyphro, and this is a version of the question raised in that dialogue. It begs the question: if we say truth is that which is revealed to us, presumably by the gods, then one could ask, well, is the truth the thing that the gods tell us? In other words, whatever the gods tell us is by definition truth, and that's our definition of truth. Or is it that the gods are showing truth to us? In which case, if we try to stack up, the order of precedence of things, there's a fundamental ambiguity between whether the gods come first and they define truth, and truth is whatever it is that God reveals, and then it gets delivered to us, or whether the truth is something which exists somehow independently of the gods. The gods then reveal it to us, but they, in a way, are dependent on the truth themselves. So this is just one of the I guess metaphysical knots that rise when we talk about truth as being something that's revealed. There's a third, more modern way of thinking about truth. We can talk about truth as neither being neither corresponding or something which is real, but something which is constructed. That is, it's not tethered to some invisible reality out there, which is then given to us or which we somehow penetrate to, but rather it's something that we construct amongst ourselves. This one could call a deflationary definition of truth. It sort of pokes it sort of pokes it and takes the air out of it. And it's based on what you would call a posture of suspicion, really, a posture that all the purveyors of truth in the world, be they scientific or religious or what have you, may have something else that they're not telling us. They got something else up their sleeve, and that really there's some other agenda afoot than actually delivering truth to us. These masters of suspicion of the late 19th century, often there's a trilogy of them: Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, each of which in their own way took what was being developed under the overall school of modernism and thinking about reason first, and poking a hole in and saying, well, maybe there's some deeper agenda behind this. Nietzsche famously gives us his definition of truth as a result of this posture of suspicion, which has been very influential in the 20th century and beyond. And this is a definition of truth which we may have seen before. He says, what then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relationships which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred, and embellished, and which after long usage seem to be people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Seem to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths and illusions which we have forgotten truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of sensuous force, coins which have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and no longer as coins. We can think of this way of thinking about truth, which is entirely deflationary, as being really a bridge to what we would call today the postmodern, in which truth simply becomes a matter of competing narratives, which have behind them probably something about power, probably something about oppression, and ultimately something that we should be deeply suspicious of whenever someone comes to speak in the name of that truth. But that truth is also something which in the postmodernist project is something which may not necessarily exist in the realm of facts, but it may exist in the realm of story. Different stories told by different cultures may convey different kinds of truths. Truths in this sense, in this non-foundational constructed sense, may be actually found. If we go into a library, which is divided into your fiction and nonfiction section, we think, well, all the facts, all the actual truths are in the nonfiction section, and the fiction section is full of the stories. From this more postmodern perspective, you would seriously consider the possibility that the truths found in narrative form in the fiction section of the library may at least compete with those which are found in the nonfiction section of the library. So as a result of these three different ways of approaching truth and of defining the truth, we have the culture wars of today, which are playing out in all their ugliness in social media. There are different ways that lenses through which we can describe it. Trying to describe it through this lens of the history of philosophy, we could put it in the following terms: that the postmodernist mindset, that there are only local truths, that all universal truths are viewed with suspicion, that usually they're hiding oppressive power structures. This postmodernist mindset is in a heated and existential battle with a pre-modern mindset, that there is one correct dogmatic formulation of truth attained through divine revelation that we just need to accept. And these two are at complete loggerheads, and it's very difficult to find any way for them to have to be in dialogue with each other. Meanwhile, the modern mindset, the mindset that gave rise to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, that truth is discovered through reason and observation, finds itself today under attack from both sides, from both what we call the cultural left and the cultural right, and it finds itself declining in cultural influence. So what is next for the world? What is next for this project of truth, which seems to be in shambles at the moment in the world? In the spirit of a Hegelian analysis, I think we can look at these past ideas as theses and antitheses, which we'll try to bring together in some kind of a synthesis. And I think that synthesis is going to say something like this: that all of these perspectives have something important to tell us. It's not that, well, we took a wrong turn somewhere back there in century 5 or century 15 or century 19 or whatever, and we simply have to discard everything that came after and rewind the clock and go back to these earlier ways which were closer to the truth. I don't personally think that that's the path forward, but rather that we have to see that each of these lenses have something important to tell us, that it's not a winner-take-all situation, but somehow we have to move through them and beyond them to a synthesis, rather than picking out the winner and then trying to discard the losers. And I think from pre-modernism, we can take the idea that having some stable human reference point for truth in the moral sphere is useful, perhaps even necessary, for humanity going forward, i.e., a prophet is something we cannot dispense with. From modernism, I would take the idea that the scientific method and the exercise of reason reveals predictable structures behind things. And from postmodernism, really a whole host of ideas, among them, the idea that language and grammar can get in our own way of thinking clearly, that because words refer to other words, which refer to other words in turn, and in a way, it's all a kind of big circular reference system when we really try to drill down on what language is revealing to us about what we take to be true. And also that truth and discussion about truth, and particularly purveying truth to others, can often be a fig leaf for power, exclusion, and oppression. These are ideas which we all have to, I think, willingly take, gratefully embrace as part of our collective intellectual heritage, and see where we can go with these ideas. So this is a talk about the Baha'i faith, and now I'm finally getting to the Baha'i faith, because I think the Baha'i faith has something to say about all three of these, and that embeds or embodies in some way perspectives common to these three different lenses on the nature of truth. In 1931, Shoghi Effendi, speaking with, I think, incredible prescience, said the following, that surely the world contracted and transformed into a single highly complex organism by the marvelous progress achieved in the realm of physical science, by the worldwide expansion of commerce and industry, and struggling under the pressure of world economic forces amidst the pitfalls of a materialistic civilization, stands in dire need of a restatement of the truth underlying all the revelations of the past in a language suited to its essential requirements. So notice the major premise of Shoghi Effendi's analysis is that the solution, given the problem that he's diagnosing, which is the same problem that we have, that we're experiencing, I think, a century later, it couldn't have been better put. The solution is not the wholesale rejection of what we would call the pre-modern point of view, the point of view of God speaking to humanity through a succession of prophets, which is what the secular group would like, the camp would like to do. Shoghi Effendi is saying instead we need a restatement of the truth underlying all these revelations of the past. So what is the truth underlying all the revelations of the past? Then it begs that question. And this is where you'll get sort of my version of what I think at least three of the major elements of that truth underlying the revelations of the past may be. And I think, and you'll notice the color coding, I think it has something to do about how the truth is fixed and stable. It'll say something about how we get at the truth with respect, by respecting the conclusions of reason and science. And it will say, given the fact that all the religions of the world are different, and we haven't set ourselves up with the project of picking the winner out and saying all the rest are losers, instead we have to validate all of them, then something about the truth is changing and evolving in time and between cultures and individuals at any given moment in time. Those are really two very important separate ideas rolled into one there under point 3. So let me unpack these a little bit more. So there's something about how the truth stays the same. That there's something important about having a common premise. There's something important about not just about the world, a stable, coherent world civilization going into the future, not being, it's not a stable configuration for us to imagine that the future world is going to continue being a bunch of deeply competing tribes that start from completely different premises about the world. And I think that the thing that stays the same amid all the change, Baha'u'llah actually tells us, fortunately, he says what it was. He says, everything changes, he says. Know thou, he says, that in every age and cycle, all laws and ordinances have been changed according to the requirements of the times, except the law of love, which like a fountain ever flows and whose course never suffers change. So we know what that unchanging piece is. It's the law of love. Everything else is going to change with the changing times. So if we ask what is the ground truth of things, we can say, okay, we have at least identified that one piece, which is a ground truth, which is the reality of love. And the other piece of this thing that stays the same, the thing that provides a fixed point around which humanity can rally is the idea of a prophet of the book as a premise. And I use the word premise very carefully because in logic, a logical argument is comprised of two parts. It's comprised of the premise, which you simply take as given. Hopefully it's a reasonable premise that other people are likely to agree on. And following from the premise, the chain of arguments that lead to the conclusion. It's the same in mathematics. All mathematical theorems have two parts. They have the axioms that they begin with, which again are taken as given. You're supposed to read the axiom and say, yes, this is clear enough to me. It's something that doesn't need proof. And then there's a sequence of mathematical operations that lead to the conclusion. An analogous sort of a thing happens in physics, where you have the initial conditions of a system, which then evolve in time according to the laws of physics, which produce a result, which can be a kind of a prediction. In all three of these cases, there's something which you simply have to take as given. You plug that in, and then you run through it according to the rules of reason to get to the result. I think similarly, a prophet is like the premise. The prophet is something that we all have to start with as a point for further development, as a point for further action and thought. Baha'u'llah puts it very strongly in a number of different ways. In one way, he puts it here. He says, "Weigh not the book of God with such standards and sciences are current amongst you, for the book itself is the unerring balance established amongst men. In this most perfect balance, whatsoever the peoples and kindreds of the earth possess must be weighed, while the measure of its weight should be tested according to its own standard." And if you think that this invites us into a kind of circularity where the word, what is considered to be, if this privileges revealed truth over everything else in the pre-modern sense, then we find in the second principle that we can say is derived perhaps from philosophical modernism, is the idea that reason and our observation of the world can actually take precedence over what we take to be the truth from our interpretation of revealed works. Abdu'l-Baha puts it in many different ways, just a couple more or less taken at random from his statements. He says, every religion which is not in accordance with established science is superstition. Religion must be reasonable. If it does not square with reason, it is superstition and without foundation. It is like a mirage, which deceives man by leading him to think it is a body of water. God has endowed man with reason that he may perceive what is true. And he says elsewhere, whatever the intelligence of man cannot understand, religion ought not to accept. Religion and science walk hand in hand, and any religion contrary to science is not the truth. So somehow the first principle and the second principle have to play nice together. We somehow have to think about our quest for truth in a way that admits of the existence and necessity of a premise, and at the same time allows that our reading of that premise to be something which is informed by reason, observation, and science. And finally, the third piece, and this is taken more from the modern or postmodern movement, is the idea that there's something, while there is something unchanging about religion, at the same time, there's something which is relative to time and perspective. There's something which is in a constant state of flux. And that leads us to what Shoghi Effendi, in a number of different places, has described really as the bedrock principle of the Baha'i faith, which is the principle of the relativity of religious truth. Again, seems to be in tension on the face of it with the first principle, that there's a fixed point of truth. There's something unchanging, but then also there's something which is in constant change. I'll just read one or two of these. He says, the fundamental verity underlying the Baha'i faith is that religious truth is not absolute, but relative. That divine revelation is not final, but progressive. He says it's the bedrock of Baha'i belief. And he says he inculcates the basic principle, Baha'u'llah, he says, inculcates the basic principle of the relativity of religious truth. Its aim, he said, is to widen the basis of all revealed religions and to unravel the mysteries of their scriptures. So this idea of relativity, however, is not something which is only at the surface. And this is another important point I'd like to make, and that is that it's not simply a matter of the trappings of religion that are relative to time and place, that evolve with time. It's not simply the the customs, the dietary requirements, the rules for when and how you pray and in what direction you face when you pray and that sort of thing, which all changes between one religion and the next. It goes much deeper to the very theological constructions of religion. The principle of relativity, I submit, is active in those areas as well, and it has profound implications for what we think about the truth and what we think about the quest for truth. I'll give you just a few examples, maybe not even the best examples from the Baha'i writings, but a few of them. One of them is, well, who is the prophet? What is the prophet that we are to take as our premise, as our collective premise going forward? There are those who have always argued for a very, what we would call high theophanology, the idea of the prophet being in some way equivalent to, you can just put an equal sign between the prophet and God. After all, sometimes they say, I am God. Some of the mystics have too, which has gotten them into trouble. And also, from another perspective, the prophets talk about their humanity, their limitations, their poverty, their sufferings. Baha'u'llah says these are both equally true ways of thinking about it. These two completely opposite perspectives on the nature of the prophet. Baha'u'llah says, were any of the all-embracing manifestations of God, i.e. the prophets, to declare, I am God, he verily speaketh the truth, and no doubt attaches thereto. And were they to say, we are the servants of God, this is also a manifest and indisputable fact. So this also extends to the idea of whether we regard the prophets fundamentally as the same or different from each other. And Baha'u'llah says, or here, and Abdu'l-Baha both say that they're both right. Yeah, it all depends on your perspective. So the sun is used as the analogy in both of these quotations. Baha'u'llah says, consider the sun. Were it to say now, I am the sun of yesterday, it would speak the truth. And should it, bearing the sequence of time in mind, claim to be other than that sun, it still would speak the truth. And Abdu'l-Baha, using the analogy of the sun and the mirror, says, thus should the mirrored sun proclaim, I am the sun, this is but truth. And should it cry, I am not the sun, this is the truth as well. So to the nature of the prophet, the nature of God in the world as well is one of a third example of how in the Baha'i writings we have a very kind of deep principle of relativity that applies. This one is to me the most surprising one of all, because this gets at what in philosophical terms we would summarize as the question of theism versus atheism versus pantheism versus deism. The question is asked at one point of Baha'u'llah, of these four schools of thought, which one is the correct school of thought? And one might think that Baha'u'llah, as a prophet in the line of the great prophets of the house of Israel, would say something like, well, the theistic position, obviously, because that has the idea of God revealing prophets in time, and I'm one of those prophets. And so why doesn't he pick that one out as being the correct school of thought and the others as incorrect? But Baha'u'llah doesn't do that. And it's quite a long passage, and because of time constraints, I won't read it all, but I'll just leave this up here as a slide. But I'll just read the conclusion of it, which is, I think, the shocker. And this is where Baha'u'llah, after saying that one of these stands closest to righteousness or God-fearingness, which is indeed the theological position, and this is a feature of time and place, he says one can, however, provide a justification for the tenets of the other schools. For in a sense, all things have been and shall ever remain the manifestations of the names and attributes of God. So we see an incredible theological openness as regards the foundation layer of what different religions have fought over and argued over for so long. Baha'u'llah saying, look, it all depends on your perspective. You can justify these very different perspectives. And really, to put an exclamation point on this, at the level of individuals, Baha'u'llah also affirms, without making a judgment, really, that there is an intrinsic difference in viewpoint between individuals, which is a feature of the world, and which we're not going to be eradicating anytime soon. It's something we are going to live with, and not just live with, hopefully, but flourish through, because through that diversity of viewpoint, we find our strength as a species. We find our strength going forward. Through maximizing our inclusion of diverse viewpoints, we maximize the different angles onto whatever truth and reality is, and maximize our chance of finding it and finding an efficient path into the future. Baha'u'llah puts this way. He says, since all do not possess the same degree of spiritual understanding, certain statements, he speaks very delicately, certain statements will inevitably be made. And there shall arise as a consequence as many differing opinions as there are human minds, and as many divergent beliefs as there are created things. This is certain and settled, and can in no wise be averted. So, and this idea of relativity, which I think is so I don't know, simpatico with a certain aspect of postmodernist thinking, can be seen to flow from a very deep principle that was enunciated in the realm of physics by Niels Bohr, who was one of the architects of quantum mechanics in the last century. And Niels Bohr put it in this way. He said, the opposite of a correct statement is a false statement. But the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. And I think we've seen several examples of that in the last few slides. But we should also, I think, issue the caution that this statement of relativity does not imply a sort of anything goes relativism where all opinions become equally valid. Because while we have a posture of openness and inclusion towards diverse opinions, in the spirit of the scientific method, we also submit all of these opinions and ideas, particularly if they're going to impact the physical world, we submit them to the kind of skeptical scrutiny that ultimately enables us to weed out which ones actually correlate with reality and which ones don't. And so the relativity, the principle of the relativity of religious truth should be very carefully distinguished from the principle of moral relativism, which is a different argument, and one which I think is not sustainable, because ultimately, if there is a reality out there, then not all theories about the reality are going to map equally well onto it. There are going to be theories that work and theories that don't. But this principle of relativity of religious truth, this deep principle of complementarity, as Niels Bohr called it, I think has the great benefit and challenge at the same time of discouraging for us the attempt to create a kind of a single one-size-fits-all grand narrative that we then wish to impose or invite the entire world into. Perhaps with the best of intentions, but we have facing us a kind of irreducible diversity of human perspective, which is going to lead to different kinds of theological perspectives, which I think implies that a single grand narrative is never going to be satisfying to everybody on the planet at the same time. Now, what about a meta-narrative? Now we beg the question, well, what about a kind of meta-narrative that validates multiple grand narratives? That's, I think, the open question, and I think that may be a fruitful direction to look at. But to summarize then, what I'm arguing is that the Baha'i faith borrows, I'll say borrows in scare quotes, certain key ideas from all three phases of the philosophical tradition in the West. It borrows from pre-modernism the idea of there being a fixed and stable ground, a source of truth that, at least as far as the prophet goes, that we collectively agree on as a premise for moving forward collectively. And that secondly, from modernism, that we embrace the idea that has been so useful to us in the scientific project of giving our actual observations of the world precedence over ideas we might have based upon other considerations of the nature of what is true. And finally, from postmodernism, that we adopt and embrace, I think, the idea of language being a kind of problem in a way, that there's an ineffability, there's an inability of language to describe and convey truth, partly because every word refers to every other word in a kind of endless succession. And also to embrace the idea of the relativity of religious truth across cultures, which invites us to embrace a kind of cultural diversity and cultural expressions of reality, and to also embrace the reality that ideas about religion and ideas about truth are evolutionary in time, that they're not fixed and static, that enables us to think about truth in forward directional terms, not as something which we look backwards in time to locate humanity's closest encounter with the truth, but rather, because truth is dynamic and evolutionary, we're always looking towards the future, to getting closer and closer to truth. So, as a parting couple of metaphysical thoughts on the nature of truth, that I think take from these ideas, and then, but they may also take us in a slightly different direction. One of them is an idea of what truth is in our relationship to what we refer to as the divine, and this comes from the writings of the Bab. He says, "Verily, thy truth, the truth of thy being, is the divinity of thy Lord revealed unto thee and through thee. Thou art he himself, and he is thou thyself, except that indeed thou art that thou art, and he is that he is." It's such a beautiful expression to me of this kind of essential complementarity of spiritual truth. God is both identical with us in some way and separate from us in some way, and that somehow truth, our actual truth, the thing which we seek individually and collectively, is here all along. It's something that is that divine spark shining within. But viewed from another perspective, it's something outside us, something to which we are owed, or something to which we owe our awe and veneration. But that reality is at the same time the spark that lies within us. And finally, and I love this quotation by Abdu'l-Bahá. He was asked really a theological question about his own station, and we saw how Baha'u'llah describes the prophets in multiple stations. So someone asked Abdu'l-Bahá about his own station. He expressed a great deal of impatience with the idea, because they're asking, well, what's the truth? What's the truth of who you really are? And Abdu'l-Bahá said he took that question about truth and he put it in the direction of action in such a beautiful way, and it's worth reading to close my comments. He said these metaphysical discussions, he said, will yield no result or benefit. We must set all such debates and controversies entirely aside. Nay, we must consign them to oblivion and arise to accomplish that which is enjoined and required in this day. These are mere words bereft of inner meaning. They are mere superficialities devoid of all reality. That which is true and real is this, that we become united and agreed in our purpose and arise to flood this darksome world with light, to banish all enmity and foreignness from among the children of men, to show forth such love as to astonish the enemy, to turn ravenous and bloodthirsty wolves into the gazelles of the meadows of the love of God, to cause the oppressor to taste the sweet savor of meekness, to teach them that kill the submission and acquiescence of those that suffer themselves to be killed. Herein is reality. Herein is guidance. Herein is service. Herein is the exaltation of the world of humanity. So thanks for listening. And I hope we have time for comments and discussion about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Stephen, thank you so much. I was reminded as you were wrapping up there of the quotation from Baha'u'llah. I think it's Baha'u'llah, and I'll paraphrase, where he says the acme of human understanding is essentially the knowledge that you know nothing. And
Yeah.
the more you were talking, the more I'm like, I know
Yeah.
nothing.
The confession of helplessness, he says.
Right?
Yeah, in the face of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So much to think about, so much to mull over, but that was absolutely phenomenal. So thank you. And yeah, so definitely have time here, and love to open it up. I think the best way to do this is to, thank you, raise your hand, and I will just try to follow the order here. And if you'd rather not come off the mic, just put your question in the chat and I'll look at the chat. So we'll start with Riaz, please.
Thank you, Dr. Phelps. Could we please return to those four narratives and especially the second one, which Baha'u'llah endorses, and review his wording of that second narrative.
Ah, yes.
So we can digest. I mean, so it engraves in our being, in our minds, and we can remember it and use it in our meditations. Thank you.
Well, I can read it for you. Let's see.
Yeah, and yes, please read it and maybe explain it a little bit. So it is engraved in our consciousness.
Yes. He says it in one sentence, and this is the second school, and I've put it in the chat.
Oh,
He said, another school claimeth that God is that essence that must of necessity exist, that his messengers are the intermediaries between him and his creatures, and that their mission is to lead humanity unto him.
thank you so much. Thank you.
That's,
Thank you, Riaz. Barbara, please.
Allahu Akbar, and thank you very much. I believe maybe the last quote of Abdu'l-Baha in turning truth to action is maybe a thought there, but in light of the Western philosophy, just a brief thought on Eastern philosophy, as in Chinese philosophy, that's not shaped by the Judeo-Christian Islamic religious paradigm. Just a thought, briefly.
oh, you want my thoughts on it? That's a whole different hour-long presentation, which I'm equally or even more unqualified to give. But one thing I will, the one, I guess, top shelf thing I would say about the Chinese tradition, as we find it, for example, in Taoism, in Buddhism, and in the Advaita Vedanta of Hinduism, all three of those, I think, give us an idea of the ground of being non-dualistic as opposed to dualistic. I think that would be like the first thing I would say in contrasting the Western philosophical tradition, which is really dualistic through and through. And that, I think, very influenced by Plato as well, who saw the world as you've got this physical world and you've got the realm of forms. And that thread sort of is not just a thread, it's one of the warp threads, that goes through the history of Western thought. Whereas in the East, in the Eastern traditions, they don't start from that premise of there being a duality in creation at that level of substance that emerged with, say, Descartes and everything that followed, and that we're still, I think, very much bound to this idea of bodies and minds being two different kinds of substance. Now, of course, they recognized the clash of principles. They recognized the complementarity of those principles. So, for example, the yin and the yang of Taoism is right there a very visible expression of the principle of duality in creation. And actually, Niels Bohr put that on his. He designed his own family crest, and he put that yin yang signal on the family crest because he was himself so caught up and enchanted by this idea of complementarity. He thought that symbol from the wisdom of the mystic East was a great way of making that clear. And I think we can also find that Baha'u'llah has at least gestured in that direction in his great work, the Tablet of Wisdom, the Lohe Hekmat, where Baha'u'llah is talking about the world. He said the world of creation, he said, it's brought into being through the interaction between the active force and that which is its recipient. And he says these two are the same, yet they are different. So he also, in this great work on sort of a work of cosmology, really, of spiritual cosmology, he also refers to a duality, but then says, look, they're the same and different at the same time. And that's, I think, a step in the direction of Eastern thought.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you, Barbara. Gitti, please.
Thank you, Dr. Wells. It was an amazing analysis. Before modern era, especially in the Christian world, the only truth was Jesus Christ and the Bible. And they believed that if you believe in Jesus, he is the way, and there is no need to know anything else. And now with 1.5 billion Christians in the world, Are they looking for the truth?
You're asking me, you should ask them. Everyone is looking for the truth. I think we should give everyone on the planet credit as human beings for having some engagement with that question and having some relationship to that question. I mean, partly on that basis, I think we have this principle of the unity of the human race, that there's something that deeply unites us, and that we're all magnetized by the truth, whether we act that way or not in any given moment. It's something which magnetizes us. It's something that ultimately, when we sense the breeze of it at some point, with obviously maybe some rare exceptions, people respond to that breeze. They turn in that direction. It's like it's an invisible. It's like I was just giving this example in an earlier a podcast talk, that when you're in the southern part of the U.S. where there are palm trees, and you see these rows of palm trees planted along the road, and the palm trees oftentimes they're all leaning at the same angle, which is a kind of strange thing to see, and you wonder, why did they all choose to lean in the same direction? Until you realize, oh, there's an invisible factor that if I don't take into account, I'm not going to understand how there's a kind of directionality to these trees. And that invisible factor is that there's a prevailing wind that tends to blow in a certain direction. And so as these palm trees are growing from the state of seedling on up, they tend to be tilted a little bit in one direction. And I think that's a useful metaphor for the kind of magnetism that exists in the cosmos, a magnetism that tilts things in a particular direction, which may not be visible at the level of experiments in a laboratory, or when you try to parse what the fundamental forces of nature are. It's not going to be visible there, just like entropy is not visible at the particle level. But when you look over time, and when you look over space, and you look over large aggregates of matter doing its thing biologically, culturally, and so forth, there seems to be a directionality to things that we pick up on, and there seems to be, it's almost as though there's a grain in the stone. That's a phrase that I got from an old TV series by Bernowski, I think. If you strike on a nodule of flint, a flake will flake off of that nodule of flint, because there's a kind of there's an inner grain in that stone that enables you to form that edge. And it's not visible in that nodule of flint. It looks like this amorphous mass. But when you strike on it, a flake comes off, and that flake, it can only be there because there's a directionality embedded in the atoms in that stone. And I think that the whole cosmos, by analogy, has that kind of directionality. It's something that one can perceive, and one way to perceive it is to orient oneself in the direction one thinks is aligned with that grain, and that direction is the direction of love. And the result, because if you align yourself in that direction and move in that direction, it's like being pulled into a current, a swift current, and you find yourself being pulled downstream. Whereas if you're fighting against the current, you don't make any progress. So that's how you know it from the effect. You know it from the fruits of, as Jesus said in the Bible. How do you know the true prophets from the false prophets? It's by the fruits. And this is one way of looking at how to perceive what otherwise is taken by science, of course, as being nonsense or superstition, or at best non-existent, but which one can find traces of visible throughout the universe.
Thank you, Stephen. Moving on, Robert, please.
Thank you. So my question is about the law of love and its permanency. If by love is meant the power of attraction aspect of love, then I think that it is reasonable, because you need that attraction for everything to remain in existence. On the other hand, if you take the aspect that is relationship or love between individuals, isn't that concept also relative and not permanent, in the sense that love, for example, in Islam, that concept was quite different For example, loving thy neighbor would be to let them live. Whereas in the Baha'i faith, love has a much deeper meaning. Could you comment, please?
I think it's absolutely the case that these deeper principles, and if Baha'u'llah is right, and if that is the one unchanging thing, then I think we would not be surprised to see it manifest in very different ways in different contexts. And so we see it manifested in Christianity in this extremely spiritually elevated form of love for one's neighbor. And we see it manifested also in Baha'u'llah's writings in the same way, love for one's enemy even. How do you attain that love? You have to go deep and recognize a kind of oneness that's really not visible there in the surface. Also, I think that principle of love is manifest in some ways elsewhere in the universe that might not initially even look like the principle of love. It might map onto it pretty well, like the universal law of gravitation is a pretty obvious one. But if you want to press the metaphor and say, well, what about electromagnetism? Well, there you have attraction and repulsion. Attraction and repulsion are actually equally strong in electromagnetism. There isn't some preference towards attraction over repulsion. So there seems to be an equal force repelling things from each other. So how is a repulsive force in some way, in the end, a manifestation of this universal law of love? And one can take a stab at a big question like that and say something like, well, it's only through repulsion as well as attraction that you can have matter forming in these complex aggregates that we have in the world that we actually inhabit, that serve in some way as a substratum for the emergence of consciousness and what we call spirit and mind, and exhibiting all of the attributes that we take to be the ultimate goal of human existence, being expressing love and kindness and mercy and forgiveness and all of these high spiritual attributes are only made possible by the fact that we're constituted as these physical bodies. And if it was nothing but attraction and no repulsion, then we would just be blobs of matter. We would all be black holes or something like that. We would all be essentially inert. So it's only through the law of love being manifested in ways that don't on the surface appear to be love at all that you get an even higher manifestation of love.
Oh, thanks, Stephen. I have someone whose name is not visible. If you know who you are, can you come off mute?
Neutral face.
Neutral face. I am on. Okay. Well, we'll go to Stephen then. Stephen's up here, please.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi.
Great talk. I'm really enjoying this. This is really fantastic.
Thanks.
I want to get to something you said towards the end.
Mhm.
So how do we, I hope maybe you could you said that, granted, you said that this is something that needs to be clarified, but I just want to get your thoughts. So on the one hand, we have the idea that you really explained well that, we don't need to accept this absolute moral relativism, but that we can apply a kind of skeptical scrutiny to weed out those perspectives that are closer to reality. But there's also the idea that you mentioned that we do not want to repeat the errors of the past. We can't do a one size fits all, that a grand narrative is not going to be satisfactory. So I was hoping you could talk more about how those two needs are reconciled. I know you mentioned something about a grand narrative. Could you share any thoughts?
To reconcile
meta narrative. Sorry, I thought is what you said.
Oh, meta narrative.
Yes, not grand narrative.
So the tension I'm reconciling is between which two ideas, to sum up?
So there's the idea that you can discriminate between perspectives. Not all perspectives are equal because you use that scrutiny, that kind of scrutiny that you said, critical scrutiny that you said needs to be used to find those that are closer to reality. So that means not all perspectives are some are closer, and that we shouldn't be embracing ones that are not close to reality. We should be embracing the ones that are close.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yet at the same time, we can't have a one size fits all grand narrative, but this closer to reality assumes a grand narrative.
Okay, great question. I'll go out on a limb and just throw out there the idea that there's a fixed reality that we're all aiming at, it's a fixed target that we're shooting our arrows at, is itself a product of our space-time framework. You know, it's a product of our conception of space and time. If reality exists outside of space and time, capital R reality, then to talk about it as a stable thing or something that's in motion is itself, now we're now thrusting it back into our own sort of grammatical categories, which it may not actually fit correctly. So already to talk about, well, there's different theories and they're all trying to point at this fixed ultimate reality, and so that's how we differentiate between the right theory. Well, what if that fixed reality is itself not fixed? What if it's something that evolves with us? And that's the going out on the limb part, because we think about God, and typically God is discussed in the whole Judeo-Christian narrative as a changeless, timeless being that's beyond, of course, all of the exigencies and changes and chances of this world exist in its sort of sublime transcendence beyond all things. But that itself is like, it's a narrative construction that we use because we have no better words. I mean, we know that none of these words are adequate to describe ultimate reality. So as Abdu'l-Baha put it very pointedly in some answer questions, he said, that reality, he said, is beyond singleness. He said, how much more beyond plurality? So the fundamental categories of thought that we would like to apply to it, particularly when we think about how truth relates to it, including that it's one versus many, it's static versus changing, all of these are categories that exist in this realm of water and clay. So that's kind of problem number one, I guess. But the other, I guess, angle of approach, I think, to your question would be something like the fact that we don't accept all metaphysical theological propositions as equally true, but we have to winnow them in some way. We have to have some way of deciding at least once what subset we're going to decide is acceptable or true or valid. That process of winnowing is something which is very much a feature of time and place. And so if we were to ask that question, say, 10,000 years ago, before the advent of monotheism, the answer probably would have been something like one of the existing pantheons of gods that we have, some faint recollection of through the archaeological finds and so forth, the Norse mythos or the Sumerian gods or something like that. That was state-of-the-art theology 5,000 years ago and beyond. And now we're into the sort of the mists of history where there's almost no archaeological evidence at all. And when we think, oh, well, surely monotheism is like ultimately we can sort of talk around it because we're being delicate and we're trying to be inclusive and we're trying to be nice, but really when push comes to shove, monotheism is true and the others are false. If we want to take that position, then at best we can only take that position in relationship to this historical moment as something which is maybe true or false relative to the urgent need of humanity to rally around a single point. Not because it necessarily corresponds to that ultimate reality the way it really is. No one knows how that reality is the way it really is. But we know, as Abdu'l-Baha says in some answer questions, it's beyond singleness and plurality. I don't know if that answers or further muddies the water, but
I think there's
Thank you, Stephen.
There's certainly wisdom in God being the unknowable essence. I think we should just be happy with that for now. So Hal, I believe your hand is up.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah, this is the first time I'm joining a Zoom meeting on my cell phone because our Wi-Fi is down tonight. Now for the last 4 years, I've been conducting Zooms on my laptop, and now I see why people complain when they are joining from their cell phone. I'm just like illiterate. I don't know how to respond to your chat message or how to open my picture or my microphone. But anyway, to my question, Dr. Phelps, what you explained, how Baha'u'llah responded to those questions, that it's not this or that, reminded me of the series of questions that Manakji Sahib directed to Baha'u'llah, and seemed like he was stating his question and giving multiple choices for him to pick. And then when Baha'u'llah was responding, was saying, it's not only this and that, but he was just, Baha'u'llah was answering as if, at the same time, all of them were true. Were you referring to any of those in your talk tonight?
To Manakji Sahib.
Yes.
Yes, that was the Four Schools of Thought quotation. Yeah,
yes,
it was very
okay.
long, so I kind of referred to it, and then I put up the slide and then didn't read the whole slide, so I apologize for that. But yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Just an observation I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we'll just take a few more questions. So I have Riaz, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you very much again, Dr. Phelps. Back to that four schools of thought, and maybe my question is a bit redundant, but could you please expound on this part of the second school, where Baha'u'llah says God is that essence that must of necessity exist? Could you, with your training in, with your expansive training, comment on this statement? This statement seems to be very explicit and definitive.
Yes.
He says,
yes,
that must of necessity exist. You know that?
Yes. I'm not an expert in Islamic theology, but I believe Baha'u'llah is referring to Islamic theology here, which divides all existence into necessary existence and possible existence. And necessary existence as a category is actually confined to God, the only being that must of necessity exist, whereas everything else that exists is relegated to the category of possible existence. It could potentially not have existed if God had not willed it to exist. So it may be that Baha'u'llah was here gesturing in the direction of that, let's say, axiom of Islamic theology, which is how they attempted to define God, which is God is that being which is that sole being which must of necessity exist.
Thank you.
There may be much more to this question, but that's what I comprehend of it.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah. Now, maybe one point, derived point from this, in view of modern or postmodern thought, when Baha'u'llah asserts that, I mean, to the issue of the existence of God as a reality, here Baha'u'llah says that must of necessity exist. How does this square with the discussions about the existence of God, that kind of discussion, and the assurance that God does exist? Because here, this is very explicit.
Here's where perhaps I would retreat to the comforting domain of the postmodernists and say, well, here's where we have an issue with language itself, because we're trying to assign grammatical categories, nouns, verbs, adjectives to a being, an entity, a reality, which we're told at the same time is outside the whole space-time framework, but is at the same time somehow a cause and somehow related. And this is where it gets really strange when one is talking about God's necessary existence and in what way God exists. The way, particularly, this is discussed in theological terms in the Bob's writings, it's very, very interesting, because he says, I think following this train of thought of the Islamic philosophers of putting God on such a high transcendent pedestal that God's reality must be entirely untrammeled by the things of the world. Following on that train of thought, the Islamic philosophers said, God is not even the creator. You can't even call God the creator, because to call God the creator is to implicate God in some way in that which is created. and that in some way pulls God out of that station of utter transcendence, which is where they want to leave him. At some point, we're playing with philosophical games, but the thrust of it, I think, is an ultimate veneration of that unknown being. And I'll just add as a interesting side note that when the Bab talks about this, he noted that if you put God on such a high pedestal as the necessary being who too great even to create the world, then that begs the question of, well, then what created the world? And that's where it gets really interesting, because the thing that created the world ultimately is the logos, what Christians would call the logos, which is mentioned in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God, and then the word becomes flesh and dwells among us. There's this idea of a principle, an ordering principle, because logos in Greek also has implications of order, language. It's something that's structured. It's something that speaks. It's the primal word of God, to use Baha'i terms, the primal commanding word, which is the B and the E, joined and knit together, which is be. But who's uttering that commanding word? It's being uttered by the primal will itself. This is the weird point I was finally getting at. What the Bab says is that ultimately the universe, the direct causal agent in the creation of the universe, the Bab says, is, and perhaps he's quoting earlier Islamic philosophers, I'm not entirely sure about that point. The direct causal agent of the universe is the logos. And the logos, the Bab says, is its own cause. So you end up with a kind of principle of creation which is self-referential. And that self-referentiality of creation at a metaphysical level, and we know that we're talking about words that have lost their purchase on reality in some sense. So it's a narrative that hopefully points us in the right direction if it's not like factually correct. But the question then of the universe in some way being self-generative has fascinating implications and tie-ins with some more modern thinking connected to modern physics and quantum mechanics about cosmology and quantum mechanics, and the fact that systems exist in a state of potentiality until they're observed. What does the observing? Is it just some human consciousness brain that observes the universe into being, or is it consciousness itself somehow at a cosmic level observes itself? And that's perhaps this is an example of the logos principle that is starting to show itself in ideas in modern physics. This is all, like, of course, at the deeply speculative end of things, but I personally find it interesting, so I have to throw it out there because I love these ideas. But it helps, I think, also to point out the futility of talking about any kind of philosophical discussion about God, because the moment you open your mouth, you're saying something that's already not correct. And I think that the Jewish philosophers and theologians were on the right track when they said you can't even pronounce it. Don't even say it. When you get to the word in the Bible, replace it by Hashem. You just say the name, and don't even try to pronounce it, because. And I think that's also an approach that, in a way, goes in the right direction, because you're just not touching it. You're not soiling it by any sort of contact with reality at all. And I think that's the direction one finds also the Islamic philosophers going in their own way, and Baha'u'llah as well. Sorry about that. Maybe went on a bit.
Thank you so much, really. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I believe Ruhi Soraya, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick one. Then what is this notion of certitude? I mean, I'm just trying to conclude for myself. I mean, this is, it appears to me, a battle between solidity and fluidity. The desire for human being to be on solid ground, and then the history of humanity turns out the way it is, or is now moving towards fluidity and where it will end up. So how does all this reconcile with certitude and same yet different? Is it the case that at the end we just have to live with the idea of a mystical dimension that we live and move and have our being in, and that's it, and that's as far as?
That's such an awesome question. I don't know the answer, but I'll just, I guess, spin out a few ideas. the Baha'i writings, Abdu'l-Baha, I think Baha'u'llah as well, follow an Islamic mystic in citing that there are 3 levels of certitude. Says there is what's called the knowledge of certitude, the eye of certitude, and the truth of certitude. The ilmul yaqeen, ainul yaqeen, and haqqul yaqeen. And the first level of that knowledge of certitude is the certitude that you have when you know something is correct. It's the certitude of facts. It's the certitude of information that you've received through some process of learning about that information. So you learn about, say, how fire works, and you understand all the chemical transformations involved in fire. But beyond that is a second level of certitude, which is the ain al-yaqeen, which is literally the eye of certitude. It's the certitude you have when you actually see the fire. And if you've seen the fire, you're in a whole different category of certitude about the reality of fire than if you've only heard about fire and learned about it in, say, a science textbook. So that's the second level of certitude. And the third level of certitude is beyond both of those, and that's when you get burned in the fire. That's the haqqul yaqeen, which literally means the truth of certitude. And that truth of certitude, and by the way, the word haqq in Persian is translated as truth. It's also translated as God. So in answer to this question of what is truth, it could have been a one-sentence presentation. Well, haqq is translated in the same word as God in Persian, at least in many contexts. So that third degree of certitude of being burned by the fire is beyond a kind of, oh, I know that this thing is true in some intellectual sense. It's something I suppose one could say is just more experiential. It's being tossed in the ocean of wonderment. And yeah, you don't know which way is up when you're tossed in the ocean of wonderment, but you don't care if you're in the ocean of wonderment. It's not like, oh no, I'm confused. No, you're enjoying being in the ocean of wonderment to some extent. I mean, as Baha'u'llah describes it in the 7 Valleys, the Valley of Wonderment could also as readily have been translated the Valley of Bewilderment. Hayrat is the word translated as wonderment in the 7 Valleys, and Hayrat means wonderment in the sense of, oh, this is awesome, but it also means, oh, this is scary. It also means, oh, I'm bewildered by what's going on. I'm confused. It could have been translated almost equally correctly as the Valley of Confusion. And for Baha'u'llah, this is one of the advanced degrees of spiritual attainment, is being thrown into confusion. It's like you're well beyond the Valley of Knowledge. The Valley of Knowledge is a few valleys back. You're now in the Valley of Wonderment, and it's beyond right and left. It's beyond perceiving directionality. It's beyond perceiving truth and falsehood. It's something which is which pulls the foundations away, because that state of wonderment is something in which, and it precedes something even more kind of scary in a way. And the scarier thing is the last valley, which is the Valley of Annihilation. And it's been translated as the Valley of True Poverty and Absolute Nothingness. But fanaye haqiqi, which is the Persian phrase for it, it's true annihilation. It's a reality of self-annihilation, which is an even scarier concept to contemplate, until one realizes that it's followed by still another valley that Baha'u'llah describes in another place in his Gems of Nine Mysteries, which is the valley of immortality. So following annihilation is immortality, but it's not the immortality of the soul that sort of regains its bearings. It says, okay, I'm no longer tossed by the tempest, and now I'm back in the real world, and up is up and down is down. It's the immortality of the soul that is now living in God. It's baqa fillah. It's the immortality of that soul, of the evanescent soul, which has attained perfect evanescence and is now identified with that divine light within. And that's the ultimate, as Baha'u'llah describes it, the ultimate goal. Is that living in God, in which questions of knowledge become irrelevant.
Just quickly, Stephen, is that Abdu'l-Baha's definition of understanding? Because it seems to me that this whole, I mean, you mentioned about three certitudes, right? 3 types of certitude. I mean, is it right to say that the first 2 is comprehension and haqqul yaqeen is understanding?
Well, they can be translated in different ways. I mean, haqqul yaqeen is usually translated as the truth of certitude, as the third level. The first one is knowledge in the book learning sense, and then the other 2 are more like, There's another division in the Baha'i writings which divides things into two instead of three, and so it's a little difficult to know exactly how to map them. But the twofold division in the Baha'i writings that one also finds is the distinction between ilm and irfan, or ilm being knowledge in the books, in the book learning sense, but irfan being knowledge more in the sense of recognition, of intuitive perception of something. And that's what the mystics always talk about. They always talk about irfan. And irfan is not the same as knowledge. And it's a bit of an unfortunate fact that in English they can both be translated as knowledge because they mean completely different things. Even though sometimes Baha'u'llah himself uses them interchangeably, so one has to look carefully at context. This is one of the great complications of the translation work of the Baha'i writings is knowing when Baha'u'llah is using these in a technical sense and when he's using them in a more general sense. But there's an idea of a kind of two-level stage of knowledge being the stuff you learn about the world, and then knowledge being something at this higher level. It only comes through symbol, or it only comes through the metaphor of say the stories in the parables in the Bible, for example. You know, Jesus says, "He that hath an ear, let him hear." It's like there's something he's saying on the surface, but then if you have the ear to hear it, there's something else that's being said underneath the surface. And that's the difference. One way to think about the difference between ilm and irfan.
Thank you.
Stephen Sapir.
So then getting back to the title of the presentation, what is the truth? What is truth?
Oh, you want me to sum all that in one sentence? That's so unfair. It's our evolving and dynamic relationship. It ends up being a reference, the problem that I brought at the beginning. You know, it's an evolving dynamic relationship with reality. You know, it's something more directional and something more action oriented than it is a matter of something you sit in your chair and say, I know this fact about whatever. I guess my parting thought is that quote by Abdu'l-Baha, really, where he's asked really a metaphysical question, and the answer is, this isn't it. You know, the answer is, what is true, the haq, you know, the reality is that you go out and do. You go out and be a light. You go out and help the downtrodden. You go out and ignite the souls. You go out and be the hollow reed from which the pith of self has been blown, and you become this clear channel, and the grace flows. That's, I think, in the end, how Abdu'l-Baha defines truth. And it's not, it's not contradictory to the scientific definition of truth, but I think it's complementary, maybe in the sense of that Niels Bohr talks about complementary realities. Sometimes they seem like.
What would you consider to be the scientific definition of truth?
The scientific definition of truth is, I think, more straightforwardly the one that I introduced at the very beginning, which is the correspondence definition, which is, truth in the scientific sense is a fact, a quantifiable fact that we know to be true because it correlates with some undergirding principles of order and symmetry that exist in the universe and that are expressed in mathematical language.
Well, if it takes that, it's very difficult to understand because we may not all be mathematical. And if we're united in truth, in our belief in God and in Baha'u'llah, it seems to me that sense of being united is what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's the truth in the end that Abdu'l-Baha lands on. The truth is that we be united. That's the truth. Yeah. And that makes all of the theological disputation, which is natural and normal because we want to confine these ideas within the compass of the rational mind. But the problem is that the realm of the metaphysical does not follow Aristotle's law of the excluded middle, which is the foundation upon which all logical systems are built. And I think that if I could be so bold as to say that's kind of a founding error of Thomistic thought, of the thought of Aquinas, and so much that followed, which is the idea that divine revelation is a kind of body of fact. It's a body of information that's all coherent and self-consistent among itself, that has premises, that has conclusions that can be derived from the premises and so forth. And that one can set things up in that way, but you're going to find gaps. It's like, yeah, you can draw a map of the Earth on one sheet of paper, but you can't just represent the other side of the Earth without significant distortion or even tearing that three-dimensional surface to put it on the two dimensions. And I think this is the problem with spiritual realities, is that they cannot be confined to the language of logic. Just like, and in saying that, it's not even such a crazy thing to say in light of what we now know about the universe from the perspective of elementary particle physics and quantum mechanics. I mean, the laws of quantum mechanics do not obey the law of the excluded middle. The thing in which the law of the excluded middle, if you don't know what it is, basically says that a thing either is or is not, and it can't be both and it can't be neither. So, but that's not the case with elementary particles. I mean, quantum, in the quantum realm, a particle is kind of everywhere at once until it's observed. But if it's observed by you, it's not necessarily observed by someone else. And so your description of that particle may be different from someone else's description of the particle. And they can both be simultaneously true at the same time. One person will be just still describing it as a wave, and the other person will be describing it as a particle. This is violating the law of the excluded middle. It's violating the structure upon which we've built all of our logical systems. So we already know that the physical world, at some fundamental level, doesn't obey these logical rules that we have arbitrarily decided and tried to compress spiritual realities into. And then we build these theological systems, and then we judge everyone else according to these theological systems, and hilarity and sorrow ensue
It doesn't work.
in equal measures.
Stephen, I want to give you an opportunity to weigh in on how you're doing. There's more hands that keep coming up as you keep talking, but I want to, respect your time here. So are you okay to take a few more questions?
Yeah, I'm good. I can take some more. I'm good until the last sip of water runs out of my cup, and then my throat runs dry. So that's my only constraint right now, and I'm almost at the end.
Okay. Well, let's do these two questions, and then we'll see if we can wrap up. So Riaz, please.
Thank you again. If you remember Daniel Jordan or Dan Jordan, he used to use one of his favorite words was apprehension, which may be useful here when you describe the level of knowledge and then a level above knowledge, or erfan. So would that be a good? What's your opinion about apprehension? There's knowledge and there's apprehension.
Yeah, that's one of many words that we could choose to try to get a clean translation of the concept of erfan. I don't think any particular word in English is an exact fit, but apprehension is as good to me as recognition. And it's actually used in Baha'i translation sometimes. You can, search online for apprehension in Baha'i translations. You'll probably find it. And it may be, what makes it particularly complicated is that it's not even that the original Persian and Arabic have only two words. First of all, it's two different languages, Persian and Arabic. One of them is Indo-European and the other is Semitic. So they have different words for some basic ideas. And both, in addition to within each language, whether you're working within Persian or working within Arabic, there may be multiple words in this sort of constellation of ideas around the concept of mind, comprehension, understanding, recognition, and so forth. At one point, I tried to list them all out. I think I got to around 12 words or something, which all, if you look at how the Guardian, Shoghi Effendi has translated them, sometimes you'll see these all kind of merge into each other a bit. But you have basically a lot of different concepts in the both original languages that cannot map cleanly onto a much more limited subset of words that we have available in English, and a different sort of intellectual history. And so, some of our words are going to have Greek origins, and some of our words are going to have Latin origins. and that complicates as well on the English side. So I think what you're touching on is a deep problem of the essential ambiguities of language, the messiness of language systems, how oftentimes, and now of course Persian has a lot of Arabic words that are introduced because of historical reasons. English has so many Latin and French words introduced because of 1066 and William the Conqueror and all of that, in addition to the Germanic roots. It just makes, on both sides, it makes it a very difficult thing to think of what's the right mapping, what's the exact correct definition, or what's the exact correct translation. And it's rarely the case that you'll find one.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, last question, Pina, please.
Thank you. This is, I guess, the most important topic because of truth, finding the truth. Our journey in this world and our existence is to find out the truth. And God is so kind that He has given us a capacity to recognize the truth. And as I'm listening, I'm summarizing to myself about the knowledge, which is ilm in Arabic. Knowledge when we collect information. Like, for example, when we read something and you try to understand, and then you meditate, you pray for it to be able to go deeper and understand it. And then you come to the understanding, which is called the irfan. I guess that's what I'm learning. And,
yes.
And you go deeper than that. Again, you go deeper than that. You don't stop from understanding. You put into action what you have learned. As you said, you have to go out and find the truth through action, being and doing. So through action, actually, we learn much, much more. And with this, it will bear fruits. And what is the fruit? And you were so assured, oh, I tried this. And this is the outcome. Like I planted the seed, I nurtured it, it is growing, and the fruit came. And this is it, the beauty of the result of the knowledge, understanding, and you come to the certitude, which is ikhwan. And so I'm just imagining an analogy of the planting and growing and nurturing and the fruit come. And this all need action to be able to recognize it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful way to close, actually, because now I've run out of voice. And it's so beautifully in harmony with that last quotation by Abdu'l-Baha that I shared. And that's exactly the point I wanted to end on as well. So thank you.
Love it. I agree. That's a beautiful way to end. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughts and your questions. And obviously, Dr. Phelps, Stephen, that was just so rich and so profound. And I think a lot of us are going to take a lot away from that. So, Firuz, anything you want to say? You always have such wonderful words to share at the end.
No, first of all, I have no words to thank Stephen, and he knows I have expressed that before to him, so he knows what I mean and how I feel. Is this correct, Stephen, or not? We have till 9 o'clock to finish with a devotional. Whoever would like to stay, Pina is going to start our devotional. By the way, Stephen, Pina speaks 12 languages, including Farsi, and she is from Malaysia now, but coming from the Philippines. The friends who would like to stay back, and we will start for the next 10 minutes our devotionals. Stephen, words fail me to thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Firuz.
Firuz, you want me to stop the recording?
Yes, please.